What if the history they taught you in school wasn't wrong by accident? What if certain events, documented, verified, real events, were quietly removed from textbooks, buried in classified vaults, and scrubbed from the public record on purpose? Not by conspiracy theorists, by the government itself. We're not talking about rumors. We're talking about congressional records, declassified files, court transcripts, eyewitness testimony, events that actually happened that you were simply never supposed to find out about. Some of them stayed buried for 50 years, some for 100. A few are still not fully resolved today. Before we get into it, hit subscribe and drop a like. The algorithm actively buries this kind of content, and I need your help making sure it reaches people who should see it. Now, let's start with a city that was destroyed and then erased from the map twice. Event 1, the Tulsa Race Massacre, 1921. It is May 31st, 1921. The neighborhood of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, is one of the wealthiest black communities in the entire United States. People call it Black Wall Street, and that name is not an exaggeration. Greenwood has its own hotels, law offices, grocery stores, banks, theaters, and schools. It has doctors, dentists, lawyers, and business owners who have built something extraordinary in the Jim Crow South, a self-sufficient, thriving community that does not need to beg the white establishment for a single thing. That is, in part, what gets it destroyed. On that evening, a young black man named Dick Rowland enters an elevator in a downtown office building. The elevator is operated by a white woman named Sarah Page. What happens inside that elevator is still disputed. The most likely explanation is that Rowland stumbled, grabbed the elevator cage for balance, and Page screamed. But by the time the story moves through the white Tulsa newspapers, it has become an accusation of assault. The Tulsa Tribune runs a headline calling for Rowland to be lynched. By nightfall, a white mob has gathered outside the courthouse where Rowland is being held. A group of armed black men from Greenwood arrive to protect him. Shots are fired. Nobody is entirely sure who fired first. But what happens next is not confusion. It is organized, deliberate annihilation. Over the next 16 hours, white rioters, some of them deputized by city officials on the spot, pour into Greenwood. They shoot residents in the streets. They pull people from their homes and shoot them in their doorways. They loot businesses before setting them on fire. Witnesses later testify that they saw private airplanes flying low over Greenwood, with gunfire coming from the aircraft. Some witnesses describe the planes dropping incendiary devices, though this remains contested. What is not contested is that the airplanes were there, that they were owned by white Tulsans, and that they flew over the neighborhood as it burned. When the fires are finally out, 35 square blocks have been incinerated. Approximately 10,000 black residents have been left homeless. Somewhere between 100 and 300 people are dead. The exact number was never accurately counted because the bodies of black victims were thrown into mass graves, dumped into the Arkansas River, and buried in locations that were not recorded. The city later paved over at least one of those burial sites, and then something almost as disturbing happens. Tulsa officials and the state of Oklahoma begin erasing the event from the record. Newspaper archives are scrubbed. The Tulsa Tribune removes its original lynching editorial from its bound archives, the only newspaper in the city's collection with that page missing, for that precise date. Police and National Guard records from the massacre are sealed or destroyed. The state does not launch a serious criminal investigation. Not a single white rioter is ever charged with a crime, not one. For the next 50 years, the Tulsa Race Massacre is barely mentioned in Oklahoma schools. History textbooks skip it or reduce it to a vague reference to racial tensions. Survivors are told explicitly and implicitly to stay quiet. Many of them do, because speaking means risking what little they have rebuilt. The generation that grew up in Tulsa after 1921 is raised in a city that pretends the worst domestic attack on an American community since the Civil War simply did not happen. It is not until 1996, 75 years later, that the Oklahoma legislature commissions its first serious investigation. The Tulsa Race Riot Commission publishes its final report in 2001. The report confirms the massacre, confirms that public officials participated or were complicit, confirms that mass graves likely still exist beneath the city, and recommends reparations. No reparations are ever paid. In 2020, nearly a century after the massacre, excavations begin in Oaklawn Cemetery. Investigators find human remains. Testing continues. The city of Tulsa, which spent 100 years refusing to acknowledge what it did, is finally being forced to dig up its own buried crimes. The survivors are all dead now. They died waiting for an apology that never came and a check that never arrived. What they left behind is testimony, recorded late, preserved imperfectly, but real. Their voices describing in plain detail what it felt like to watch everything they had built turn to ash while armed men laughed in the streets. They tried to erase Black Wall Street. The ground itself wouldn't let them. Event 2, the Bonus Army March, 1932. It is the summer of 1932. The Great Depression has been grinding America into dust for nearly 3 years. Unemployment sits above 20%. Families are losing their homes. Men who fought in the trenches of World War I, men who survived mustard gas and artillery barrages and the slow drowning horror of no man's land, are standing in breadlines. Congress had passed the World War Adjusted Compensation Act in 1924. It promised veterans a bonus payment for their military service, a cash payment that would mature in 1945. But 1945 is 13 years away, and these men need money now. They need it to feed their children. They need it to keep the lights on, so they march on Washington. They call themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force. Within weeks, somewhere between 40,000 and 100,000 veterans descend on the nation's capital from every corner of the country. They come by foot, by freight train, by any means they can. They bring their wives, they bring their children. They set up sprawling shanty towns on the Anacostia Flats, a muddy stretch of land just across the river from the capital. They build shelters from scraps of wood and cardboard and corrugated tin. They fly American flags, they hold orderly demonstrations, they present their case to Congress, they earn this bonus with their blood, pay it now. The Senate votes the bill down in June. Most of the veterans begin to leave. But several thousand remain, hoping for another vote, hoping the president will intervene. President Herbert Hoover does intervene, just not in the way they hoped. On July 28, 1932, Hoover orders the U.S. Army to clear the camps. General Douglas MacArthur personally commands the operation. His aide, Major Dwight D. Eisenhower, is there. A young Major George S. Patton leads the cavalry charge. Active-duty U.S. Army soldiers, men in uniform, representing the same government these veterans had served, advance on the Bonus Army with fixed bayonets, tear gas canisters, and tanks. Actual tanks rolling through Washington, D.C. against American veterans. The soldiers burn the shantytown to the ground. Veterans are beaten. A 2-month-old baby named Bernard Myers dies after being exposed to tear gas. An 11-week-old infant also dies in the chaos. A veteran named William Hushka is shot and killed. Another veteran, Eric Carlson, is shot and dies from his wounds shortly after. Both men had served honorably in the war. Here is where the story gets deliberately murkier. In the immediate aftermath, the Hoover administration works aggressively to control the narrative. Official government statements describe the Bonus Army as a communist-infiltrated mob, not as veterans. MacArthur holds a press conference and describes the marchers as insurrectionists, a direct threat to the government. He claims the action was necessary to prevent revolution. The newspapers largely go along with it at first. But the newsreel footage doesn't lie. Americans who see the films of soldiers in uniform gassing and bayoneting their own veterans are horrified. The political fallout is catastrophic for Hoover. He loses the 1932 election to Franklin Roosevelt in a landslide that November, in part because those images are seared into the public consciousness. What gets suppressed more successfully are the specific details. The exact number of injuries is never officially tallied. The records of Army conduct during the operation are not fully released for decades. MacArthur's direct defiance of Hoover's explicit order, Hoover had specifically told MacArthur not to cross the Anacostia Bridge and attack the main camp, is covered up. MacArthur crosses anyway, and Hoover allows the fiction that he acted on orders to stand, because admitting otherwise would create an even larger political disaster. The deaths of the children, the veterans shot by soldiers, the burning of a community of American families, these details are minimized or omitted in official Army records. The operation is sanitized into a necessary act of civil order, not a violent assault on men who had served their country. Congress eventually passes an early bonus payment in 1936, but the veterans who were beaten and gassed in 1932 never receive any acknowledgement that what happened to them was wrong. MacArthur is celebrated as a hero. Patton goes on to command armies in World War II. The Army's conduct in 1932 is not investigated or prosecuted. What remains is the footage, the photos, the testimony of veterans who described being charged by cavalry and gassed by soldiers in the same uniforms they had once worn. The government wanted those images to fade. They haven't. Event 3, the Ludlow Massacre, 1914. Before we get to the 20th century's most famous labor battles, let's go to the southern Colorado coalfields in the spring of 1914, because what happens here is one of the most violent attacks on American workers in history, and for decades, it barely registers in the national conversation. The coal mines of southern Colorado are owned largely by the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, and the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company is owned, in significant part, by John D. Rockefeller, Jr. The miners who work these mines live in company towns. They are paid in company scrip, not real money. They buy their food from company stores at company prices. They live in company housing, which the company can take away the moment they step out of line. They work in mines where safety standards are suggestions, not requirements. Accidents kill dozens of men every year. In September 1913, the United Mine Workers of America calls a strike. 11,000 miners walk off the job. They demand union recognition, a 10% wage increase, an 8-hour workday, and the right to use their own money at stores of their choosing. These are not radical demands, they are basic human dignity demands. The company responds by evicting the striking miners from company housing. The miners set up a tent colony at Ludlow in an open field. Families huddle together in canvas tents through the Colorado winter. The company hires the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, a notoriously violent private security firm, to intimidate the strikers. They bring in a vehicle they call the Death Special, an armored car mounted with a machine gun. It periodically drives past the tent colony, firing into the camp. Colorado Governor Elias Ammons calls in the National Guard, allegedly to keep the peace. But the Guard is funded in large part by the mining companies. Its loyalties are not ambiguous. On April 20, 1914, National Guard soldiers surround the Ludlow tent colony. What triggers the violence is disputed. The Guard claims the miners fired first. Survivors and subsequent investigations suggest otherwise. What is not disputed is what happens next. The National Guard opens fire on the tent colony with rifles and machine guns. The attack lasts all day. Miners grab their weapons and return fire, trying to protect their families. As night falls, Guard soldiers move through the camp. They pour kerosene on the tents and set them on fire. In the chaos, women and children who have dug pits beneath their tents to shelter from gunfire are trapped. In one pit beneath a tent, investigators the following morning find the bodies of 2 women and 11 children. They have suffocated and burned to death. Among the dead are 3-year-old Lucy Costa, 4-year-old Clorava Petrucci, and 6-year-old Frank Petrucci. In total, at least 25 people die at Ludlow, including those 11 children. The massacre triggers a 10-day uprising. Miners armed themselves across the coalfields and attacked mine installations, killing company guards. President Woodrow Wilson sends in federal troops to restore order. Here is how the story is buried. Rockefeller and the mine companies immediately launch a sophisticated public relations campaign. They hire Ivy Lee, often considered the father of modern public relations, to manage their narrative. Lee produces pamphlets, newspaper statements, and press releases portraying the miners as violent agitators and the National Guard as peacekeepers. He sends these materials to newspapers across the country. Many of them print it without question. The congressional investigation that follows is underfunded and slow. The National Guard officers who ordered the attack on the tent colony are never criminally charged. Not one person is ever convicted for the deaths of those 11 children. A military tribunal clears the guardsmen of wrongdoing, a tribunal convened by the same military that conducted the operation. Rockefeller goes before Congress and testifies that he supports the right of workers to organize, which is a remarkable lie to tell with a straight face while his company's guards are shooting minors' children. He later hires a Canadian labor relations expert named Mackenzie King to develop what he calls a company union, an in-house organization designed to give workers the illusion of representation while keeping them from joining real unions. It becomes a template for union busting that American corporations use for generations. Ludlow is not forgotten entirely. Labor historians and union activists keep the memory alive. But in mainstream American history education, it is a footnote if it appears at all. The children who died in that pit are not household names. The men who gave the orders that killed them never faced justice. What the Rockefellers and their allies understood is that if you control the press and you control the narrative long enough, time does the rest of the work for you. The miners are gone, their grandchildren are gone. The tent colony is a monument in a field in Colorado that most Americans will never visit, but the records exist, the testimony exists. The photographs of those 2 women and 11 children, lifted out of that pit on April 21, 1914, exist. And they tell a story that no amount of public relations management can fully erase. Event 4, Operation Northwoods, 1962 proposal. We have already talked about some of the things the U.S. government actually did. Now let's talk about something they almost did, something so disturbing that when the documents were finally declassified, Americans had to sit with the uncomfortable knowledge that the people running their military had calmly, professionally, and unanimously proposed it. It is 1962. The Cold War is at its most intense. Cuba sits 90 miles off the coast of Florida, now under Fidel Castro and tightly aligned with the Soviet Union. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion has humiliated the Kennedy administration. The Joint Chiefs of Staff are desperate for a pretext to invade Cuba and remove Castro by force. So they draft a plan. They call it Operation Northwoods, and it is one of the most extraordinary documents in American military history. The proposal, signed by every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and submitted to Defense Secretary Robert McNamara in March 1962, recommends a series of false flag operations, staged attacks designed to look like Cuban aggression, that would give the United States a public justification for military invasion. The document is meticulous, bureaucratic, and utterly terrifying in its casual willingness to kill American citizens. Here is what Operation Northwoods specifically proposes. 1. Develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area and other Florida cities. Stage bombings, time the bombings to coincide with speeches by Cuban leaders, and blame Havana. The document explicitly mentions targeting Cuban refugees in the United States, real people, real casualties, to generate what it calls a helpful wave of national indignation. 2. Sink a boatload of Cuban refugees. The proposal suggests using fake or actual Cuban refugees, putting them on a boat, sinking the boat, and blaming Cuba for the attack. The document acknowledges that real deaths would generate more convincing outrage. 3. Create an incident at Guantanamo Bay. Stage a fake attack on the American base, complete with injured American soldiers, and use it as a pretext for military escalation. 4. Stage the hijacking of a civilian American airliner. A real plane would be substituted with a drone aircraft painted to match the civilian jet. The real plane, with its real passengers, would land safely at an alternate location under cover. The drone would be destroyed over Cuba to simulate a shoot-down. The document discusses in clinical terms how to ensure the passenger manifest looks convincing. 5. Shoot down a U.S. military drone and claim it was a civilian aircraft carrying student charter passengers. Manufacture a fake passenger list. Generate grief and outrage over the dead civilians. 6. Conduct harassment of civil aircraft and surface vessels. Stage incidents in international waters that can be blamed on Cuba. Use the resulting diplomatic and public pressure to build the case for war. Read this document, the actual document. It was declassified in 1997 and is available from the National Security Archive at George Washington University. The language is clean, professional, bureaucratic. These are not the ravings of a lunatic. These are career military officers, writing in formal government prose, proposing to murder American civilians and manufacture evidence to justify a war. President Kennedy receives the proposal. He does not merely decline it, he is reportedly furious. He dismisses the Joint Chiefs' recommendation and shortly thereafter removes General Lyman Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs who championed the plan, from his position. Kennedy sends Lemnitzer to command NATO forces in Europe, which is effectively a removal from the center of American military planning. McNamara later claims he does not recall receiving the document, which, given that it is addressed directly to him and signed by the entire Joint Chiefs, is a remarkable claim. For 35 years, the document sits in classified storage. The American public has no idea that their military leadership, in 1962, unanimously agreed to a plan to blow up American aircraft and sink boats full of Cuban refugees to start a war. When James Bamford, a journalist and national security expert, discovers and publicizes the documents in his 2001 book Body of Secrets, the reaction is extraordinary, because Operation Northwoods was not a fringe proposal. It was not rejected for being monstrous, it was rejected because Kennedy said no. If Kennedy had been a different kind of president, if he had been more hawkish, more willing to be sold on the pretext, Operation Northwoods could have become Operation Northwoods Executed. The lesson of Operation Northwoods is not merely historical. It is a demonstration that the instinct to fabricate pretexts for military action existed at the highest levels of the American military establishment, that it was formally documented and unanimously endorsed, and that it was only stopped by the refusal of one man. One president said no. That's all that stood between the United States and a government-planned massacre of its own civilians to start a war. Keep that in mind the next time someone tells you that the government would never do something like that. Event 5, the Wilmington Coup, 1898. Here is something that your American history textbook almost certainly did not tell you. The United States has experienced exactly one successful coup d'etat in its history, one moment where an elected government was violently overthrown by force and replaced with an unelected regime. It happened in 1898. It happened in Wilmington, North Carolina. And for most of the 20th century, it was described not as a coup but as a race riot, a framing so dishonest that it borders on historical fraud. Let's set the scene. By the late 1890s, Wilmington is one of the most racially diverse and politically complex cities in the South. Reconstruction-era politics have created an unusual coalition. Black Republicans and white Populist Party members have formed a fusionist government that controls Wilmington's city council and much of the state legislature. Black men hold public office. They work as aldermen, as magistrates, as police officers. The city's register of deeds is a black man. Wilmington has, by the standards of 1898 America, a functioning multiracial democracy. This enrages the white supremacist wing of the Democratic Party. In the months leading up to the November 1898 election, Democratic leaders in North Carolina, led by former Congressman Alfred Moore Waddell, launch a campaign of intimidation, fraud, and race baiting so explicit that the architects are publicly boasting about it. They establish the Red Shirts, armed paramilitary groups who ride through black neighborhoods threatening voters. They use newspapers to publish inflammatory and fabricated stories about black men. The party's platform is explicitly white supremacist, not coded, not implied, but stated openly in speeches and print. The Democrats win the 1898 election through a combination of genuine votes, voter suppression, and outright fraud. But here is the critical detail. The fusionist officials who are currently in office do not face election in 1898. Their terms are not up. Under the law, they remain in office. The incoming Democratic majority has no legal mechanism to remove them until their terms expire. So Waddell and his allies decide to simply seize power by force. On November 10, 1898, the day after the election, a mob of somewhere between 500 and 2,000 armed white men gathers in Wilmington. They march to the offices of the Daily Record, a black-owned newspaper whose editor, Alexander Manley, had published an editorial challenging white supremacist narratives about black men. They burn the newspaper office to the ground. Then they march on City Hall. The sitting Republican mayor and aldermen are dragged from office or forced to resign under the threat of immediate violence. Waddell, who holds no elected office, is installed as mayor. The other coup leaders take positions throughout city government. Black officials are expelled from their positions and, in many cases, from the city entirely. Armed groups move through black neighborhoods. Estimates of the dead range from a handful to over 60, with the lower numbers reflecting only those deaths the white authorities acknowledged. Black residents are loaded onto trains at gunpoint and told never to come back. A legitimately elected government has been overthrown, by force, by coup, in the United States in 1898. And then the cover-up begins. The coup leaders control the narrative from the start because they now control the government and the local press. The events are described as a race riot, language that implies both sides were equally responsible for violence, that it was spontaneous rather than planned, that it was a mutual conflict rather than an organized overthrow. This framing persists in North Carolina history writing for most of the next century. The federal government, which under the Constitution is obligated to protect states against domestic insurrection, does nothing. President William McKinley does not send troops. He does not investigate. He does not challenge the new Wilmington government's legitimacy. The coup leaders face zero federal consequences. North Carolina state history textbooks largely omit the event or describe it in passive, sanitized terms. For generations, Wilmington schoolchildren are not taught that their city was the site of the only successful coup in American history. It is not until 1998, the centennial of the event, that North Carolina finally commissions a serious historical investigation. The 1898 Wilmington Race Riot Commission publishes its final report in 2006. The report uses the word coup. It names names. It describes the planning, the execution, and the cover-up in detail. It recommends economic development for the descendants of those displaced. No reparations have been paid. No monuments to the coup's victims stand in Wilmington. Several of the coup's leaders are memorialized in statues and street names that still exist in North Carolina today, the only successful coup in American history. It took 100 years to call it what it was. Event 6, the My Lai Massacre, 1968. It is the morning of March 16, 1968. Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, United States Army, enters the hamlet of My Lai in Quang Ngai Province, South Vietnam. The soldiers have been told that the village is a stronghold of Viet Cong forces. They have been told to expect armed resistance. They have been told to destroy the village. What they find in My Lai is not an armed enemy force. They find old men, women, children, and infants going about their morning routines, cooking rice, feeding animals, beginning their day. There is no armed resistance. Not a single weapon is found in the village. What happens next takes approximately 4 hours. Under the command of Lieutenant William Calley, and with the knowledge and participation of officers up the chain, Charlie Company kills everyone they can find. They shoot people standing in their doorways. They drive people into ditches and shoot them. They sexually assault women and girls before killing them. Calley personally fires into a group of civilians crowded in a ditch. He orders soldiers who hesitate to comply on pain of being shot themselves. By the time the killing stops, somewhere between 300 and 500 civilians are dead. The official South Vietnamese government count is 347. Vietnamese sources put it higher. The dead include pregnant women, the elderly, and infants. An 18-month-old child is among the victims. And then the cover-up begins. The Army's own report of the operation describes it as a military success. Charlie Company reportedly killed 128 enemy combatants. That is the report filed up the chain of command. The massacre is described as a combat engagement. The dead civilians become enemy dead. The entire event is falsified from the bottom up. One man tries to stop it in real time. Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, Jr., flying an observation helicopter above My Lai, watches what is happening below with horror. He lands his helicopter between a group of fleeing civilians and American soldiers advancing on them. He orders his crew to train their weapons on the American soldiers and tells the soldiers that if they fire on the civilians, his crew will open fire on them. He evacuates civilians in his helicopter. He radios his superiors and reports what he has witnessed. His reports are dismissed. His complaints go nowhere. He is not decorated. He is not protected. He is, in the subsequent years, threatened and harassed by people who see him as a traitor for reporting on American troops. The massacre remains hidden for more than a year. In November 1969, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh publishes the story. He had been tipped by a former soldier who could no longer live with the silence. Hersh's reporting wins the Pulitzer Prize. The photographs taken by Army photographer Ronald Hebrel, photographs of the dead, of the women and children in the ditch, are published in Life magazine and cause international outrage. The Army is forced to investigate. The investigation, called the Peers Commission, confirms that a massacre occurred and that it was covered up at multiple levels of command. It identifies more than 24 officers who knew about the massacre and failed to report it accurately. Here is the accounting. Charges are brought against 14 officers for their roles in the massacre and the cover-up. 13 of those cases are dismissed before trial. One man is convicted, Lieutenant William Calley, who is found guilty of personally murdering 22 civilians. Calley serves 3 days in prison before President Nixon, responding to enormous political pressure from people who consider Calley a victim of an unfair system, orders him released to house arrest. In 1974, Calley is released entirely. He lives the rest of his life as a free man. Not a single officer above Calley's rank is convicted of anything in connection with My Lai. Captain Ernest Medina, who commanded Charlie Company and was present during the massacre, is acquitted. General Samuel Coster, who commanded the division and whose headquarters received and suppressed Thompson's reports, has his Distinguished Service Medal revoked, a decoration, not a conviction. He is reduced 1 rank on retirement. The pilots and crew who attempted to stop the massacre, Hugh Thompson, Lawrence Colburn, and Glenn Andreotta, are not recognized with military honors until 1998, 30 years later. Thompson and Colburn are still alive to receive them. Andreotta had died in combat 3 weeks after My Lai. What My Lai reveals is not just one atrocity. The Peers Commission investigation turns up evidence that similar incidents had occurred in Quang Ngai Province and elsewhere, smaller massacres that never became public because no journalist found the right source at the right time. My Lai was not an aberration, it was the one that got out. The Army's systematic cover-up of My Lai, the falsification of reports, the suppression of Thompson's complaints, the minimal accountability for everyone except the lowest-ranking convicted officer, represents an institutional effort to protect itself from the consequences of what it had done and allowed. 300 to 500 civilians, 4 hours, 1 conviction, 3 days in prison, that is the complete accounting. Event 7, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, 1930–1972. We touched on Tuskegee in the sample script, but this story deserves to be told completely, because the full picture of what the United States government did and how deeply it embedded the cover-up into every layer of the medical establishment is worse than the summary version most people know. It begins in 1932. The United States Public Health Service launches a study in Macon County, Alabama, with the stated goal of documenting the natural progression of untreated syphilis in black men. They recruit 399 black men who have already contracted syphilis and 201 men without the disease as a control group. They tell the participants they are receiving treatment for bad blood, a local term used to describe a variety of ailments including syphilis. They do not tell them they have syphilis. They do not tell them they are in a medical experiment. They do not tell them they are being watched, not treated. They give them aspirin. They give them vitamins. They give them free meals on examination days. They give them burial insurance, which is, in retrospect, a deeply revealing detail about what the researchers understood the outcome of this study would be. What they do not give them is treatment. In 1947, 15 years into the study, penicillin becomes the standard and effective treatment for syphilis. The drug is not hard to obtain. It is not experimental. It works. The men in the Tuskegee study are not given it. The U.S. Public Health Service continues the study, continues watching, continues documenting, now making a deliberate, documented choice to withhold a cure from men dying of a treatable disease. Here is what that decision costs. As syphilis progresses untreated, it attacks the cardiovascular system, the nervous system, and the brain. It causes heart disease, it causes blindness, it causes dementia. It kills slowly and agonizingly. 28 men died directly of syphilis during the study. 100 more die from complications related to untreated syphilis. Their wives contract the disease from them. 40 wives are infected. 19 children are born with congenital syphilis, born with a disease they would not have had if their fathers had been given a drug that cost cents per dose. The study continues for 40 years. It is not a rogue operation run by a few bad actors. It is funded by the U.S. Public Health Service. It is carried out by physicians and researchers. It is published in medical journals. 13 peer-reviewed papers are published about the Tuskegee study between 1936 and 1973, describing the study's findings in clinical, detached language. The medical establishment reads these papers. Medical schools cite them. Not enough people ask the obvious question. The question that Peter Buxton, a public health service investigator, asks in 1966 and again in 1968. Buxton writes formal memos questioning whether the study violates basic principles of medical ethics. He is told to mind his business. The study's physicians defend it. The Centers for Disease Control convenes a review panel in 1969 that votes to continue the study. The review panel includes a black physician who raises no ethical objection. In 1972, Buxton leaks the story to journalist Gene Heller at the Associated Press. On July 25, 1972, the story hits the front pages. Within days, the study is shut down. 40 years of deliberately withheld treatment. Ended by a newspaper story, the Senate holds hearings. Senator Edward Kennedy is appalled. A class action lawsuit is filed on behalf of the men and their survivors. In 1974, the government settles for $10 million. Living subjects receive $47,000 each. Families of the deceased receive $15,000. Here is what the settlement does not cover and what you should sit with. The wives who were infected receive nothing. The children born with congenital syphilis receive nothing. The researchers who conducted the study face no criminal charges. The physicians who published the papers describing the study's methods and results, who, in publishing those papers, were implicitly endorsing an experiment built on deceit and denial of care, are not disciplined by medical licensing boards. The CDC officials who voted in 1969 to continue the study despite ethical objections face no consequences. In 1997, President Clinton formally apologizes. 8 surviving participants attend the White House ceremony. Clinton calls what happened shameful. He is right. He is also speaking 25 years after the study ended and 65 years after it began. The legacy of Tuskegee is not only the deaths of those men and their families. The legacy is the documented, quantifiable erosion of trust in the American medical system among Black Americans that researchers can still measure today. Studies consistently show that Black Americans are more likely to decline certain medical treatments and to distrust medical institutions, a rational, evidence-based response to a documented history of being experimented on without consent. Tuskegee is not ancient history. The last survivor died in 2004. The last widow died in 2009. The government's crime did not end in 1972. Its consequences are still unfolding. Event 8, the MOVE bombing, 1985. This one is not ancient history. This is not something that happened before living memory. This happened on May 13, 1985, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a major American city, and it is one of the most extraordinary uses of state violence against civilians in modern American history. MOVE is a Black liberation organization founded in West Philadelphia in the early 1970s by a man named John Africa. The group is unconventional and confrontational. They are loud. They use profanity in public speeches delivered through bullhorns. They believe in returning to a natural way of life. They feed stray animals and refuse to send their children to public school. They accumulate a communal compound at 6221 Osage Avenue in a residential West Philadelphia neighborhood. Their neighbors hate them, and some of what their neighbors describe, the noise, the vermin attracted by feeding stray animals, the public confrontations, represents genuine grievance. But what happens on May 13, 1985, is not a proportionate response to a neighborhood dispute. MOVE had previously had a violent confrontation with police in 1978. One officer was killed. 9 MOVE members were convicted of degree murder in a trial that MOVE and their supporters called a miscarriage of justice. By 1985, those members are still in prison. MOVE members at the Osage Avenue compound are demanding their release. In the spring of 1985, after years of escalating tension, the city of Philadelphia, under Mayor Wilson Goode, a Black mayor, decides to move against the MOVE compound. Police declare an emergency and evacuate 600 neighbors from the surrounding blocks. On the morning of May 13th, police attempt to serve arrest warrants on MOVE members. A gunfight breaks out. What happens next is the part that defies belief. A Pennsylvania State Police helicopter flies over the MOVE compound. A Philadelphia police officer drops a bomb on the roof. The device contains between 4 and 6 pounds of Tovex, an explosive used in mining, combined with a detachite explosive. It is not a tear gas canister. It is not a smoke device. It is a bomb dropped on a residential neighborhood by the police in America in 1985. The bomb ignites a fire on the roof of the MOVE compound. The fire department, standing by with hoses, is ordered to let the fire burn. Philadelphia Fire Commissioner William Richmond later testifies that he was told by police, by officials, to let it burn. The fire spreads. It spreads from the MOVE compound to the adjacent row houses, then to the houses beyond those. By the time the fire department finally begins fighting the blaze, 61 houses are burning. When the fire is out, 61 homes are destroyed. 250 people are left homeless, and inside the MOVE compound, 11 people are dead. 5 of them are children. The oldest child is 13 years old. The youngest is 7. The only survivor from inside the compound is a 13-year-old MOVE member named Birdie Africa, later known as Michael Moses Ward, who manages to escape through a window. He survives. He is the only one. The official response is a masterclass in institutional protection and accountability avoidance. A special investigation commission, known as the MOVE Commission, is convened. In 1986, it issues a report that is scathing in its criticism of both the police and the mayor. It calls the decision to drop the bomb unconscionable. It says the decision to let the fire burn was grossly negligent. It concludes that the operation was fundamentally flawed from planning to execution. No one is criminally charged for the deaths of 11 people, including 5 children. Not the officer who dropped the bomb, not the officials who ordered the fire department to stand down, not the mayor. Mayor Wilson Goode is reelected later in 1985. What happens next is its own scandal. The city promises to rebuild the destroyed homes and compensate the displaced residents. They rebuild the homes so poorly, with faulty construction and substandard materials, that within years many of the rebuilt houses are uninhabitable. The city is sued. A jury awards victims over $12 million in 2005, 20 years after the bombing. The remains of the MOVE bombing victims become the subject of a scandal that breaks in 2021, when it is revealed that bones recovered from the site in 1985 and identified as belonging to a 12-year-old MOVE member named Tree Africa have been kept, and in some cases displayed, by the University of Pennsylvania and Princeton University as part of a forensic study. For decades, the child's remains were held in academic institutions without the family's knowledge or consent. The city of Philadelphia bombed a residential neighborhood, killed 5 children, left 250 people homeless, charged no one with a crime, rebuilt the houses badly, lost the lawsuit, and stored a child's bones in a university. 39 years later, the people responsible have never faced criminal accountability. Some of them are still alive, all of them are free. Event 9, The Trail of Tears, 1830s. There is a tendency, when discussing what the United States government did to Native American nations, to speak in abstractions, to talk about westward expansion and displacement and conflict in language so soft that the actual human reality becomes invisible. Let's not do that here. Let's talk about what actually happened during the forced relocations of the 1830s, and more importantly, let's talk about how generations of American institutions worked to minimize, mythologize, and erase it. By the late 1820s, the Cherokee Nation occupies millions of acres in Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, and North Carolina. The Cherokee are not, by any measure of the word, a primitive society. They have a written language created by Sequoyah in 1821. They have a constitutional government modeled partly on the United States Constitution. They have schools, newspapers, and farms. They have converted to Christianity in large numbers, adopted European agricultural practices, and engaged in diplomatic relations with the United States for decades. None of it is enough, because gold is discovered on Cherokee land in 1828, and the state of Georgia begins passing laws to strip the Cherokee of their rights and seize their land. President Andrew Jackson, a man who has personally participated in violent campaigns against Native Americans and who has a documented record of hatred toward them, signs the Indian Removal Act in 1830. The law authorizes the forced relocation of native nations from their ancestral homelands in the Southeast to what is vaguely designated as Indian Territory west of the Mississippi River. The Supreme Court of the United States, in a case called Worcester v. Georgia in 1832, rules that Georgia's laws stripping the Cherokee of their rights are unconstitutional. The Cherokee Nation has treaty rights. The federal government is bound to honor them. Andrew Jackson's reported response is effectively, "Make me." He refuses to enforce the ruling. In 1838, President Martin Van Buren, Jackson's successor, orders the forced removal to begin. U.S. Army soldiers and state militia units move into Cherokee territory. Families are dragged from their homes at gunpoint. They are held in stockades, open-air military camps, barely sheltered, poorly supplied, for weeks and months before the removal begins. People die in the stockades from disease, from exposure, from the violence of guards. Then they march. The Cherokee walk in multiple groups over multiple routes through the fall and winter of 1838 and into 1839, approximately 1,000 miles to Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. The march happens in the worst possible conditions. The U.S. government contracts out the removal to private companies who underprovide food, clothing, and medical care in order to maximize profit. People walk with inadequate shoes in freezing weather. They sleep in the open. Dysentery spreads. Measles kills children. The best estimates suggest that somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 Cherokee died during removal, in the stockades, during the march, and in the years immediately after arrival in Indian Territory. Some estimates go higher. The dead are the elderly, the young, the sick, the most vulnerable, killed by a forced march conducted by a government that had just been told by its own Supreme Court that it was violating the law. The Cherokee call it non-adult Sunni, the place where they cried. In English, it becomes the Trail of Tears, and then, for a very long time, it is minimized into something almost sentimental. By the late 19th century and well into the 20th, the dominant American historical narrative treats the removal as regrettable but inevitable, the natural consequence of civilization advancing westward. School textbooks describe it in passive terms. Indians were relocated. Conflicts occurred, the frontier expanded. The active agents, the government, the army, the private contractors who profited from underfed and underclothed people dying in the cold, are background figures. The myth of the vanishing Indian, the idea that Native Americans were simply fading away naturally before European civilization, serves to reframe removal as historical inevitability rather than government policy. If they were already disappearing, then the army was merely speeding along an inevitable process. This framing is fiction, but it is fiction that becomes embedded in American historical education for more than a century. Andrew Jackson's face is put on the $20 bill in 1928. He remains there today. It is not until the late 20th century, as Native American scholarship and activism force a reckoning with the historical record, that the language begins to shift, that textbooks begin using the word forced and removal in the same sentence, that the deaths are counted rather than waved away. The federal government has never formally apologized for the Trail of Tears as a specific event. A formal apology to Native peoples generally was included in a defense spending bill in 2009, attached to a spending bill, not presented as a standalone acknowledgement, signed quietly by President Obama, and never formally delivered to tribal leaders in a public ceremony. There is a monument to Andrew Jackson on horseback outside the White House. It has stood there since 1853. Event 10, The Business Plot, 1933. This one sounds like the most outrageous conspiracy theory you have ever heard, except it was investigated by Congress. It was confirmed by congressional investigators. The man who reported it testified under oath, and then somehow almost nothing happened, and the story was allowed to fade from public consciousness with a speed that is itself remarkable. It is 1933. Franklin Roosevelt has just been inaugurated. The Great Depression is at its worst. Roosevelt's New Deal, his program of government intervention, relief spending, and financial regulation, is beginning to take shape, and a group of extraordinarily wealthy American businessmen are extraordinarily unhappy about it. The men who approach retired Marine Major General Smedley Butler in the summer of 1933 represent serious money and serious organizations. Gerald Mac Geyer, the primary contact, is a bond salesman with connections to prominent Wall Street figures. He eventually tells Butler he represents a group that includes figures connected to the Morgan banking interests, to major manufacturers, and to former Democratic Party organizers. The pitch Mac Geyer delivers to Butler evolves over multiple meetings. Initially, he tries to recruit Butler to speak at an American Legion convention in favor of returning to the gold standard. Butler is suspicious. He plays along. Over the following months, the proposal becomes explicit. A group of wealthy men, Mac Geyer tells Butler, want to organize 500,000 veterans into a private army, funded by the plotters, equipped with weapons, and commanded by Butler. The force would march on Washington. Roosevelt would not be overthrown outright. Mac Geyer describes a scenario in which Roosevelt, overwhelmed by the demands of the Depression, would be grateful for a Secretary of General Affairs to take some of the burdens of governance off his hands. This new position effectively would run the country. Roosevelt would be a figurehead. What the plotters are describing is a fascist coup modeled on what Mussolini had done in Italy. Mac Geyer had traveled to Europe and studied fascist movements. He described the proposed organization explicitly in terms borrowed from European fascism. Butler is not interested. He is also recording and documenting everything. In November 1934, Butler reports the plot to the FBI and to congressional investigators. He testifies before the House Special Committee on Un-American Activities, the McCormack-Dickstein Committee, in executive session. His testimony is explosive. He names names. He describes the meetings in detail. He presents the committee with corroborating evidence, including a journalist, Paul French, who independently confirms that Mac Geyer had made similar proposals to him. The committee investigates. Their final report, issued in February 1935, confirms that Butler's testimony is credible and that a plot existed. The report states that a fascist organization was being planned. It names Mac Geyer. It confirms the essential outline of what Butler described. And then, in a move that historians have puzzled over for decades, the committee's final published report redacts the names of most of the businessmen alleged to be behind the plot. The individuals Mac Geyer claimed were financing and organizing the operation are not named publicly. They are not called before the committee to testify publicly. They are not indicted, not charged, not investigated in any sustained way. Mac Geyer denies everything. He dies in 1935, shortly after testifying of natural causes. According to the record, no one else is held accountable. The newspapers at the time are divided. Some cover it seriously. Others, particularly those owned by the very wealthy industrialists who might have had reason to want the story buried, dismiss it as fantasy or exaggeration. Time magazine calls it a plot without plotters. The New York Times gives it coverage, but notes skeptically that no military action had actually occurred. Butler spends the rest of his life speaking publicly about what he calls the relationship between war, wealth, and government. In 1935, he publishes a short book called War is a Racket, in which he describes his 33 years of military service as the work of a high-class muscle man for big business. He names the corporations he believes he served during his military career. He becomes one of the most decorated and outspoken critics of American militarism and corporate power in the country. He is largely ignored by official history. What we know for certain, Butler testified under oath. A congressional committee confirmed the essential facts of his testimony. The plotters, whoever they were at the highest levels, faced no legal consequences. And a story about a planned fascist coup against the President of the United States was allowed to sink from public consciousness within a few years. The business plot has never been thoroughly reinvestigated with the full power of a congressional subpoena and modern forensic accounting. The records of the men Mac Geyer named have never been fully opened. We know a plot existed. We do not know its full dimensions because the investigation was stopped before it went deep enough to find out. That, too, is a form of cover-up. Event 11, the Kent State shootings, 1970. May 4th, 1970. It is a Monday. On the campus of Kent State University in Ohio, National Guard soldiers open fire on students. 4 students are killed, 9 are wounded. One of the wounded, Dean Collar, is permanently paralyzed. Of the 4 dead, 2 were not even participating in the protest. Jeffrey Miller, Allison Cross, William Schroeder, and Sandra Shewer are dead. The context is this. On April 30th, President Nixon announces that American forces are expanding the Vietnam War into Cambodia. College campuses across the country erupt in protest. At Kent State, protests become increasingly tense over the following days. The National Guard is deployed to campus on Saturday, May 2nd. Buildings are set on fire. The ROTC building burns on Saturday night, and National Guard soldiers watch it burn, which may or may not say something about what happens next. By Monday, May 4th, a rally has been called on the Commons, the open grassy area at the center of campus. Officials try to disperse the crowd with a bullhorn from a jeep. The crowd responds with rocks. The National Guard advances with tear gas. The wind is blowing in the wrong direction and the gas disperses uselessly. The crowd continues throwing rocks. The Guard retreats to a hill called Blanket Hill, pauses, and then, without any order that investigators have ever been able to identify conclusively, without any command from a commanding officer, without any imminent physical threat that justified lethal force, 28 National Guard soldiers turn, raise their rifles, and fire. The shooting lasts 13 seconds. 67 rounds are fired. Jeffrey Miller is shot in the mouth. He is 265 feet from the nearest guardsman. Allison Cross is shot in the chest. William Schroeder is shot in the back. Sandra Schuer is shot in the neck. She is 390 feet from the nearest soldier. She is walking between classes. She is not part of the protest. In the immediate aftermath, the Nixon administration's response is to blame the students. Vice President Spiro Agnew has spent months calling anti-war student protesters radical liberals and effete snobs. When students are killed, Agnew does not soften his rhetoric. He describes the protesters as responsible for their own fate. Press Secretary Ron Ziegler says the incident underscores the importance of maintaining law and order. President Nixon's official statement expresses regret, but notes that when dissent turns to violence, it invites tragedy. The statement implies the dead students brought it on themselves. It does not mention that Sandra Schuer was not involved in any dissent. She was walking to class. The Justice Department opens a federal grand jury investigation in 1971. The grand jury indicts not the guardsmen, but 8 Kent State students for rioting. The indictments are eventually dismissed. A separate federal grand jury investigation in 1974 indicts 8 National Guard members for civil rights violations. A federal judge dismisses all charges before trial, ruling that the government has not shown that the soldiers acted willfully. In 1975, a civil lawsuit brought by the families of the dead and wounded is settled. Ohio pays $675,000 to be divided among the 9 wounded students and the families of the 4 dead. The settlement includes a statement of regret, not an apology, signed by the named defendants. The photographic record of Kent State is one of the most powerful in American history. John Philo's photograph of 14-year-old runaway Mary Ann Vecchio kneeling over Jeffrey Miller's body wins the Pulitzer Prize. The image circulates worldwide. It becomes one of the defining images of the Vietnam War era, but the broader official narrative works to contain the incident's meaning. The FBI's investigation into Kent State, a massive investigation involving more than 8,000 interviews, produces a report that is partially suppressed for years. When journalist Peter Davies obtains and analyzes the FBI findings, he concludes that the guard fired without provocation and that the official investigation had been inadequate. The full FBI summary report on Kent State is not made public until 2010, 40 years after the shooting. The commanding officers who were present on May 4th are never convicted of anything. The soldiers who fired are never convicted of anything. The Nixon administration officials who set the political tone, who described protesters as the enemy, who created a rhetorical environment in which shooting students could be justified as restoring order, face no accountability. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young Record, Ohio, within days. It is on the radio within weeks. The song asks a question, 4 dead in Ohio, that American courts and government bodies spend the next decade declining to answer honestly. The question is still not fully answered. Event 12, COINTELPRO, 1956-1971. The FBI's COINTELPRO program is one of the most thoroughly documented examples of a government systematically targeting its own citizens for destruction, not for crimes they had committed, but for ideas they held and movements they participated in. We know what COINTELPRO was, in unusual detail, because of one of the most remarkable acts of civil disobedience in American history. On March 8, 1971, the same night Muhammad Ali fights Joe Frazier at Madison Square Garden, when virtually every FBI agent assigned to the area is watching the fight, a small group of activists breaks into the FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania. They take every file in the office, they cart them out in suitcases, they mail copies to journalists and members of Congress. What the files reveal is extraordinary, and what they reveal prompts the Church Committee investigations that, in the mid-1970s, exposed COINTELPRO's full scope to the American public for the first time. The program runs from 1956 to 1971 under FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Its targets include the Communist Party USA, socialist organizations, the Ku Klux Klan, Puerto Rican independence groups, the American Indian Movement, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Black Panther Party, the Nation of Islam, Students for a Democratic Society, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The list is so broad that it encompasses virtually the entire spectrum of political dissent in mid-century America, left, right, and center. The tactics are methodical and comprehensive. The FBI employs informants to infiltrate organizations and report on their activities. But informants are only the beginning. COINTELPRO operatives forge letters to create conflict between civil rights leaders. They send anonymous letters to wives claiming their husbands are having affairs, designed to destroy marriages and undermine leaders. They send letters to employers to get activists fired. They plant false stories in newspapers. They create fictitious rival organizations and use them to discredit legitimate ones. They mail letters to street gangs encouraging them to attack Black Panther members. They work to have activists charged with crimes, sometimes with fabricated evidence. The program's treatment of Martin Luther King Jr. is perhaps the most extensively documented example. The FBI wiretaps King's hotel rooms and private residences. They compile files on his personal life. In 1964, they assemble a recording from their surveillance, a package designed to suggest King had engaged in extramarital affairs, and mail it to him with an anonymous letter. The letter urges King to kill himself before accepting the Nobel Peace Prize. The letter is typed with deliberate errors designed to suggest it was written by a disgruntled colleague rather than a federal agency. The Church Committee investigation later attributes the letter conclusively to the FBI's COINTELPRO operation. The original letter is held in the National Archives. In 2019, a newly discovered version of the letter is analyzed by Yale historian Beverly Gage, who publishes an account of the unredacted text. The letter is more vicious than the version previously known. It calls King a fraudulent degenerate. It is one of the most disturbing documents in the history of American law enforcement, a letter produced by a federal agency and designed to convince a Nobel laureate that he should die. The Church Committee, chaired by Senator Frank Church of Idaho, conducts its investigation in 1975 and 1976. It produces 14 reports documenting in extraordinary detail the scope of COINTELPRO and related intelligence abuses. The committee concludes that the FBI conducted a sophisticated vigilante operation against American citizens. It finds that COINTELPRO activities were illegal and unconstitutional. The committee's findings prompt significant reforms. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act is passed in 1978. Guidelines for FBI domestic intelligence operations are established by Attorney General Edward Levi. Oversight mechanisms are created, and yet, not one FBI agent is ever convicted of a crime related to COINTELPRO. J. Edgar Hoover died in 1972, before the full extent of the program became public. The agents who carried out the operations, who forged letters, who worked to drive activists to suicide, who planted evidence and manufactured conflicts, are never charged. The activist group that broke into the media, Pennsylvania, FBI office and exposed COINTELPRO to the world is not identified until 2014, when they reveal themselves publicly. Keith Forsyth, John and Bonnie Raines, and their colleagues describe 40 years later why they did it. They saw the government targeting people for their political beliefs. They saw no other way to expose it. They were never prosecuted. The statute of limitations had run out. The Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI, as they called themselves, broke into a government office, stole classified documents, and mailed them to the press. In doing so, they exposed one of the most extensive programs of government suppression of political speech in American history. The FBI spent years trying to find them and couldn't. Justice, in this case, came not from the courts but from a group of ordinary citizens with suitcases and a willingness to break the law to tell the truth. Event 13, the Attica Prison Uprising, 1971. It is September 9, 1971. Attica Correctional Facility in upstate New York is one of the most overcrowded prisons in the United States. 1,241 inmates are held in a facility designed for 600. The men, predominantly black and Latino, live in cells where the temperature regularly exceeds 90 degrees in summer. They receive one roll of toilet paper per month. They shower once a week. Their meals cost an average of 63 cents per day. Violence by guards is routine and rarely disciplined. The killing of Black revolutionary George Jackson by guards at California's San Quentin prison on August 21, 1971, reverberates through every American prison. At Attica, inmates organize. They compile a manifesto, a list of 27 practical demands, including adequate food, medical care, religious freedom, and an end to arbitrary punishment by guards. They request to meet with state officials and with outside observers. On September 9th, after a confrontation sparked by the disciplining of 2 inmates, the prisoners take over the prison's D-yard. They take 33 guards and civilian employees as hostages. They set up an organized community in the yard, complete with medical care, negotiations, food distribution, and a security force protecting the hostages from harm. The hostages are not mistreated. Inmates place themselves between the hostages and angry prisoners. The hostages are protected. Negotiations begin. Inmates present their demands. A group of outside observers, including journalists, attorneys, and civil rights leader Bobby Seale, are allowed into D-yard. The observers include New York Times reporter Tom Wicker, who later writes extensively about what he witnesses. The inmates are articulate, organized, and clearly capable of conducting serious negotiations. Governor Nelson Rockefeller is asked to come to Attica and negotiate directly. He refuses. He does not come to Attica, not once. He manages the crisis from his office in Albany. This decision is later described by the observers, by investigators, and by Rockefeller's own aides as a critical moment. Had Rockefeller come, a settlement was likely possible. Instead, on September 13th, after 4 days of negotiations, Rockefeller orders the state police to retake the prison by force. The assault begins at 9:46 in the morning. State police helicopters drop CS gas, tear gas, into D-yard. Snipers positioned around the prison's walls open fire. Troopers armed with rifles storm the yard. The firing lasts approximately 6 minutes. When it stops, 33 inmates and 10 hostages are dead, 43 people in total. Here is what the state of New York immediately says about those deaths: that the hostages were killed by inmates, that the inmates had slashed hostages' throats, that the violence was committed by prisoners. Every single word of it is a lie. Medical examinations of the dead begin within hours. The hostages, like the inmates, were killed by gunfire. The state police shot them. The state police, firing with rifles from elevated positions, with inadequate ability to distinguish hostages from prisoners in the chaos and tear gas and smoke, shot and killed both the men they were sent to rescue and the men they were sent to subdue. Dr. John Edlin, the Monroe County medical examiner, performs autopsies. He finds that every hostage was killed by gunfire, state police gunfire. He goes public with his findings, immediately, and immediately the state of New York moves to suppress him. Officials pressure Edlin to change his findings. He refuses. He testifies before investigators. He holds press conferences. The evidence is overwhelming and unambiguous. The hostages died in the state's assault, not at the hands of inmates. Faced with irrefutable medical evidence, the state changes its story. But the initial narrative, that murdering inmates killed the hostages with knives, has already been broadcast nationally. Rockefeller uses it to justify the assault before it is debunked. Many Americans believe the initial story and never hear the correction. A grand jury investigates the assault and surrounding events. Between 1974 and 1976, it indicts 62 inmates and 1 corrections officer. The charges against the officer are dropped almost immediately. The prosecutions of inmates drag on for years. Not one state police officer is ever indicted for the killing of hostages or inmates. Not one. The men who fired the rifles that killed 10 hostages and 23 inmates are never charged with a crime. The McKay Commission, an independent investigation appointed by Rockefeller himself, publishes its report in 1972. It is scathing. It describes the assault as the bloodiest one-day encounter between Americans since the Civil War. It criticizes the decision to assault rather than negotiate. It identifies a pattern of state police violence during and after the assault, including beatings of inmates who had already surrendered. A class action lawsuit on behalf of inmates and survivors drags through the courts for decades. In 2000, New York State settles for $12 million. In 2005, the state pays $8 million more to the surviving correction officers and families of the hostages who were killed by state police fire. The uprising at Attica and its violent suppression remain one of the starkest examples in American history of the state inflicting lethal violence, lying about what it had done, and then spending decades avoiding accountability through the very legal system it controls. The last lawsuit related to Attica was not resolved until 2005, 34 years after the assault. The families of those who died in D-Yard waited 3.5 decades for a partial accounting. Event 14, the Banana Wars, 1898–1934. Here is a phrase you may not have encountered in your high school history class: the Banana Wars. And here is why that matters, because what the United States military did throughout Central America and the Caribbean between 1898 and 1934, largely to protect the business interests of American corporations, represents one of the most sustained periods of military imperialism in modern history, and it has been systematically downplayed, minimized, and euphemized in the American historical record. The basic pattern is this: an American corporation, a fruit company, a railroad company, a bank has investments in a Caribbean or Central American nation. The local government raises taxes on the company, or grants concessions to a rival, or attempts to nationalize a resource, or simply elects a leader who is considered unfriendly to American business interests. The State Department registers its displeasure. American businessmen with political connections lobby the government. The U.S. Marines arrive. This pattern repeats with variations across Nicaragua, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Panama, Guatemala, and Honduras between 1898 and the mid-1930s. Nicaragua is occupied by American Marines almost continuously from 1912 to 1933, 21 years. The United States trains and arms a local military force, the Nicaraguan National Guard, to maintain order, which in practice means suppressing political opposition to American-friendly governments. Augusto Cesar Sandino leads a guerrilla resistance against the occupation from 1927 until the Marines leave in 1933. The following year, the National Guard, trained and equipped by the United States, assassinates him. The leader of that National Guard, Anastasio Somoza Garcia, begins a family dynasty that rules Nicaragua with brutal authority and with American support until 1979. Haiti is occupied from 1915 to 1934. The official pretext is political instability and the protection of American financial interests, specifically National City Bank of New York's control of Haiti's national bank and government debt. Haitian sovereignty is effectively suspended for 19 years. The U.S. installs client governments. It rewrites the Haitian constitution to allow foreign ownership of land, previously prohibited, over the objections of Haitian legislators. American Marines supervise a forced labor system that puts Haitian peasants to work building roads. When Haitians resist, the military suppresses them. An estimated 2,000 to 3,000 Haitians are killed during the occupation. The Dominican Republic is occupied from 1916 to 1924. Again, the stated reason is political instability. The underlying reason is American banks' interest in Dominican debt and customs revenue. The United States government takes direct control of Dominican customs houses, collecting tariffs and using the revenue to pay American creditors. The occupation trains a military force that, after the Americans leave, is commanded by Rafael Trujillo, who becomes one of the most brutal dictators in hemispheric history, ruling the Dominican Republic with savage authority until his assassination in 1961. In case after case, the pattern holds: American military intervention, an installed or supported local military force, the long-term consequence of authoritarianism and instability that the United States then uses to justify further interventions. The man most associated with calling this what it was is the same man who reported the business plot, Marine Major General Smedley Butler. Butler served in Nicaragua, in Haiti, in the Philippines, in China. He is, at the time of his death in 1940, the most decorated Marine in American history. And in his famous 1935 pamphlet, War is a Racket, he describes his service with remarkable candor. He writes, describing his years of military service, that he helped make Mexico safe for American oil interests, that he helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank to collect revenues in, that he helped purify Nicaragua for the international banking house of Brown Brothers, that he helped make Honduras right for American fruit companies. He calls himself a racketeer for capitalism, high-class muscle for big business. Butler is not a radical, he is not a communist. He is the most decorated Marine in American history, speaking plainly about what he observed. His assessment is not given the weight it deserves in mainstream American historical education. The United Fruit Company, later to become Chiquita Brands, is the most visible corporate actor in this history. United Fruit owns vast tracts of land in Central America, controls railroads, telegraph lines, and port facilities, and has an economic footprint in some countries that exceeds the national government's annual revenue. When the democratically elected government of Guatemala, under President Jacobo Arbenz, attempts land reform in 1954, proposing to pay United Fruit for unused land at the company's own stated tax value, the company lobbies the Eisenhower administration for action. The CIA orchestrates a coup. Arbenz is overthrown. A 40-year civil war follows, killing 200,000 Guatemalans. That is 1954. It is the same pattern as 1898, 1912, 1916. The Banana Republic is not a metaphor. It is a description of a real political order that the United States military spent decades enforcing. The official framing of the Banana Wars, when they appear in American history education at all, emphasizes political instability and the civilizing mission, the idea that the United States was bringing order and development to chaotic societies. The corporate interests that drove the interventions are mentioned, if at all, as background context rather than primary motivation. Smedley Butler's explicit account of his own role receives a fraction of the historical attention given to military campaigns in which the American narrative is more heroic. The countries where the United States intervened repeatedly in this period are today among the most economically distressed in the hemisphere. The political systems warped by American-backed authoritarianism did not recover quickly. The democratic institutions undermined by coup after coup did not rebuild easily. The migration of Central Americans to the United States that generates so much political controversy today is rooted in part in a history of instability that American policy helped create. That is not a coincidence, it is a consequence. Event 15, the Red Summer 1919, the year is 1919, World War I has just ended. Black American soldiers who fought in France, who fought bravely, who were decorated by the French government, who experienced a version of racial equality in Europe that their own country denied them, are coming home. They come home to Jim Crow, they come home to segregation, to disenfranchisement, to the casual and organized terrorism of white supremacy, and something in the country shifts. Black Americans who fought for democracy abroad are no longer willing to accept the denial of democracy at home with the same silence. The new Negro, the phrase is used by intellectuals and activists of the era, is a different figure than the broken, accommodating image white supremacy required. He came back from the war with a weapon and the knowledge of how to use it, and in the summer of 1919, when white mobs attacked black communities across the country, some Black Americans fight back. The response of those white mobs, and of the governments that mobilized to suppress Black self-defense while largely ignoring white violence, defines what the NAACP's James Weldon Johnson calls the Red Summer. The violence spreads across at least 26 cities between late spring and early fall of 1919. Washington, D.C., Chicago, Elaine, Arkansas, Knoxville, Tennessee, Omaha, Nebraska, Longview, Texas. These are not isolated incidents. They are part of a sustained wave of racial violence spanning the entire country, north and south. In Chicago, the violence begins on July 27th when a Black teenager named Eugene Williams drifts across an informal boundary in Lake Michigan between a white beach and a Black beach while swimming. White men on the shore throw rocks at him. He drowns. The police refuse to arrest the men who threw rocks. Black witnesses demand action. Fighting breaks out. What follows is 13 days of racial warfare across the south side of Chicago. White gangs, many of them athletic clubs with connections to Democratic Party ward bosses, attack Black residents. Black residents defend themselves and counterattack. White rioters pull Black passengers from streetcars and beat them. 38 people are killed, 23 of them Black. Over 500 are injured. More than 1,000 Black families are left homeless when their homes are burned. The Illinois State Militia is eventually called in. When order is restored, the city convenes the Chicago Commission on Race Relations to investigate. Their report, published in 1922, is a detailed and honest account of the causes and events of the riot. It documents white mob violence, the role of athletic clubs and political machines in organizing white rioters, and the economic and social conditions that created explosive tensions. It is largely ignored by city government. In Elaine, Arkansas, in late September 1919, the scale of violence is even larger and the suppression of the story more complete. Black sharecroppers in Phillips County are organizing through the Progressive Farmers and Household Union, an attempt to negotiate better terms with white landowners who are systematically cheating them out of their cotton profits. White men, including a special agent for a Missouri railroad and a deputy sheriff, fire into a union meeting at a church. In the violence that follows, 5 white men and somewhere between 100 and 240 Black people are killed. The exact number will never be known because the deaths of Black people in Elaine are not officially counted with any precision. The federal government sends in troops. The troops, under the command of white officers, do not restore order neutrally. They assist white mobs in hunting Black residents through the fields. They round up Black men. 12 men are sentenced to death for the deaths of white men during the violence. 67 more are sentenced to prison. Not one white person is convicted of any crime related to the deaths of over 100 Black people. The Supreme Court eventually overturns the death sentences in Moore v. Dempsey in 1923, ruling that the trials had been a sham, that the juries were white. The proceedings lasted 45 minutes, and the process was controlled by a white mob threatening further violence. The ruling is a landmark in constitutional law. The underlying story of what happened in Elaine, Arkansas, of Black sharecroppers slaughtered for trying to organize economically, receives little attention in mainstream historical narratives for decades. Across the Red Summer's geography, the pattern repeats. White mobs attack Black communities. State and local governments suppress Black self-defense while allowing white violence to proceed or proceeding slowly against white perpetrators, and the deaths of Black people are minimized or uncounted in official records. The press coverage in white-owned newspapers often frames the violence as a race riot, a neutral term implying equal responsibility, rather than as a series of attacks on Black communities by white mobs. This framing shapes how the events are understood and preserved in the historical record. A riot sounds mutual. A massacre, an attack, a pogrom, these are the words that more accurately describe what happens in Elaine, in Washington, in Chicago. Black newspapers, the Chicago Defender, the NAACP's The Crisis, edited by W.E.B. Du Bois, cover the Red Summer with accuracy and outrage. Their reporting is the primary historical record for many of these events. White mainstream papers either minimize the violence or frame it in ways that protect white perpetrators. The Red Summer of 1919 is not in most American history textbooks as a distinct event. The individual incidents, the Chicago race riot, the Elaine massacre, appear sometimes. The pattern, the nationwide coordinated nature of the violence, the political and economic forces driving it, are rarely taught as a whole. 100 years later, the Elaine descendants of the men imprisoned after the massacre were still working to have their names officially cleared. Event 16, the Palmer Raids, 1919-1920. The year is 1919, and America is afraid. The Russian Revolution has brought the Bolsheviks to power. Socialist and anarchist movements are active across Europe. Labor unrest is explosive in the United States. 4 million American workers go on strike in 1919, the highest number in the country's history. In April 1919, mail bombs are sent to 36 prominent politicians and businessmen, including the Attorney General himself. In June, 8 coordinated bombs explode in 8 cities on the same night. The fear is real. Some of the threat is real. But what happens in response is a catastrophic violation of civil liberties that targets hundreds of thousands of innocent people and is carried out with the explicit blessing of the Department of Justice and the active participation of what will become the FBI. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer is the architect. He creates within the Justice Department a new General Intelligence Division and appoints its first head, a 24-year-old lawyer named J. Edgar Hoover. Yes, that J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover begins building files on radical organizations with extraordinary speed and thoroughness. He compiles dossiers on hundreds of thousands of individuals. He organizes intelligence-gathering networks. He prepares for what becomes the largest peacetime roundup of political suspects in American history. The raids happen in 2 major waves. The first wave comes in November 1919. Agents raid the headquarters of the Union of Russian Workers in 12 cities. Hundreds of people are arrested. Many are beaten in custody. The legal basis for many of the arrests is either extraordinarily thin or non-existent. The government is relying on immigration law, the ability to deport foreign nationals who are members of proscribed organizations, as the primary legal tool, because actual criminal law requires evidence of actual crimes. In December 1919, the government deports 249 people to the Soviet Union on a ship that the press calls the Soviet Ark. Among the deported are Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, both of whom are American by immigration but not birth. Goldman is one of the most prominent political figures in the country. She is removed from the United States without a proper hearing. The second wave comes in January 1920. Agents raid dozens of cities simultaneously on the night of January 2nd and 3rd. Approximately 10,000 people are arrested in a single night. More than 500 cities and towns are affected. People are arrested in their homes, in meeting halls, at chess clubs, at language schools, at labor union meetings. Many are arrested simply for being in the wrong building when agents arrive. Bystanders are swept up. Citizens are arrested alongside foreign nationals. The conditions in which prisoners are held are frequently brutal. In Boston, hundreds of people are forced to march handcuffed through the streets, a deliberate humiliation. They are held for weeks in overcrowded facilities with inadequate food and no access to legal counsel. In Detroit, 800 people are held for days in a single corridor with one toilet. In Hartford, Connecticut, prisoners are held for weeks. Here is the accounting that matters. Of the approximately 10,000 people arrested in the January raids, roughly 500 are ultimately deported. Most of those arrested, the overwhelming majority, are released without charges, because the evidence required to deport them, under even the extremely loose standards of immigration law, does not exist. They were arrested because they attended a meeting, because they lived in the same building as someone with a political affiliation, because they were foreign-born and spoke a language other than English. The legal challenge to the raids comes from inside the Justice Department itself. Assistant Secretary of Labor Louis Post, who has jurisdiction over deportation proceedings, reviews the cases and dismisses more than 2,000 deportation orders as legally defective. He is nearly impeached by Congress for doing so. He defends himself before a House committee and survives. Legal aid societies, civil liberties advocates, and a group of prominent lawyers, including future Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, issue a detailed report documenting the illegality of the raids, the arrests without warrants, the denial of access to counsel, the physical abuse of prisoners, the detention without legal basis. The report is published in May 1920 and creates significant public controversy. Judge George Anderson of the Federal District Court in Massachusetts becomes the most important legal check on the raids. In a series of decisions through 1920, he rules that many of the deportation proceedings are legally void, that arrests without warrants are unconstitutional, and that the government's conduct has been lawless. He releases prisoners. He writes judicial opinions that are scathing in their assessment of the Justice Department's behavior. But here is what does not happen. No one in the Justice Department is ever prosecuted for the illegal arrests, the beatings, the detention without charges. Palmer faces no legal consequences. Hoover, whose intelligence apparatus made the raids possible and who organized much of the operational planning, is not disciplined. He is rewarded with the directorship of what becomes the FBI in 1924, a position he holds until his death in 1972. The Palmer raids are discussed in American history as a lesson about wartime hysteria and civil liberties. But the lesson that should be taught alongside them, that the government officials who carried out massive illegal arrests faced no consequences, and that the lead organizer went on to run the FBI for nearly 50 years, is the part that makes the story most instructive for understanding how institutional impunity works. Hoover learned in 1919 and 1920 that you could arrest thousands of people without legal basis, beat prisoners, deny them counsel, hold them for weeks without charge, and the most that would happen is that a few judges would let some of them go. He carried that lesson with him for the next 52 years. Event 17, the CIA's MKUltra program, 1950s-1970s. We close with MKUltra because MKUltra is in some ways the fullest expression of everything this video has been about. The government's willingness to treat its own citizens as expendable, the systematic destruction of the evidence of its crimes, and the near-total impunity with which the people who ran the program lived the rest of their lives. MKUltra begins formally in April 1953, authorized by CIA Director Allen Dulles. Its stated goal is mind control, specifically the development of techniques that could be used to interrogate Soviet agents, break the will of prisoners, and potentially create programmed assassins or couriers who could be sent behind enemy lines. The Cold War context makes it easier to understand, if not to excuse. The CIA believed that the Soviets already had mind control capabilities, a belief shaped partly by the confessions of American POWs during the Korean War, which CIA officials incorrectly attributed to brainwashing rather than torture and coercion. What MKUltra actually is, in practice, is a massive program of non-consensual human experimentation spanning at least 20 years, involving at least 150 research projects conducted through dozens of institutions and using thousands of unwitting subjects. The substances tested include LSD in enormous quantities and under conditions carefully designed to maximize psychological destabilization. They include mescaline, scopolamine, heroin, barbiturates, and amphetamines. They include electroconvulsive therapy administered at extreme intensities. They include sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation extended for days at a time, and experimental surgical procedures. They include hypnosis and psychological manipulation. They include radiation. The subjects include prisoners who are told they are part of medical research. They include mental patients in institutions who cannot consent. They include Army soldiers who are told they are testing protective equipment. They include unwitting civilians, people in bars, people at parties, people recruited through classified newspaper ads, who are given drugs without their knowledge. One of the most disturbing institutional outposts of MKUltra is a Montreal hospital. The Allen Memorial Institute at McGill University, under the direction of Scottish-born psychiatrist Dr. Ewan Cameron, receives CIA funding through a front organization, the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. Cameron has a theory called psychic driving, the idea that the mind can be wiped clean through extreme deprogramming and then reprogrammed from scratch. His methods are almost beyond description. Cameron puts patients, people who came to his hospital seeking treatment for depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, into medically induced sleep for weeks or months at a time. He delivers massive quantities of electroconvulsive therapy at intensities many times greater than standard medical use. He plays audio recordings of messages, sometimes disturbing, sometimes banal, on endless loops into the ears of unconscious patients for days or weeks. He administers LSD while patients are in these states. The results are not controlled minds. The results are profound, in many cases permanent, psychological and neurological damage. Patients who came to Cameron for help with treatable conditions leave his care unable to remember their names, their families, their entire adult lives. Their personalities are destroyed, their memories are obliterated. They require years of intensive care and never fully recover. Cameron's funding from the CIA comes through channels so thoroughly obscured that he may not have known, at least initially, that the American Intelligence Service is paying him. This does not reduce his culpability for what he does. It simply illustrates how deeply the CIA had embedded itself in legitimate academic medical institutions. The most documented use of LSD in MKUltra is Operation Midnight Climax, which we touched on briefly. CIA officer George White runs a safe house in San Francisco and later New York, where prostitutes paid by the CIA lure men to apartments and administer LSD to them without their knowledge. White observes through a two-way mirror, taking notes. In his retirement letters, discovered later, White describes the operation with cheerful enthusiasm, as though drugging strangers without consent and watching them have psychedelic crises was a delightful hobby. The CIA's own scientists are not exempt. Frank Olson, a biological weapons researcher with a security clearance who worked with the CIA, is given LSD without his knowledge in November 1953 at a retreat with CIA and Army officials. 9 days later, he dies after falling from a New York hotel room. The official verdict is suicide. His family disputes it for decades. In 1975, the Rockefeller Commission investigation of CIA abuses reveals that Olson had been an unwitting LSD subject. President Ford apologizes to Olson's family. CIA Director William Colby meets with them. In 1994, Olson's family has his body exhumed. A forensic pathologist finds evidence suggesting Olson was struck on the head before going through the window. The Manhattan District Attorney opens an investigation. It is eventually closed without charges, citing insufficient evidence. The question of whether Frank Olson was murdered by the CIA to prevent him from going public about biological weapons work, a theory that has supporters among serious researchers, is never fully resolved. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms, facing increasing congressional scrutiny over CIA domestic operations, orders the destruction of all MKUltra records. Thousands of documents are shredded. An estimated 90% of the program's files are destroyed. The CIA successfully erases most of the evidence of what may be the most extensive program of non-consensual human experimentation in American history. What survives, the 10% that was misfiled in a financial records archive at a different location and thus escaped the shredding, is enough to establish the broad outlines of the program, but leaves enormous gaps. We do not know the full number of subjects. We do not know the full range of experiments. We do not know how many people died. We do not know how many people who spent decades struggling with unexplained psychological damage were in fact MKUltra subjects who never knew what had been done to them. The Church Committee and the Rockefeller Commission investigate in 1975 and 1976. Congressional hearings are held, former subjects testify. The program is exposed in extraordinary detail, given that 90% of its records were destroyed. Not one CIA official is convicted of a crime related to MKUltra. Richard Helms, who ordered the destruction of the documents, which is itself obstruction of justice, is convicted in 1977 of lying to Congress about CIA operations in Chile, a separate matter. He receives a $2,000 fine and a suspended sentence. He is not imprisoned. He lives until 2002, receiving honors and accolades from the intelligence community for his distinguished career. The Canadian government, after litigation by Canadian MKUltra victims from Cameron's Institute, pays out reparations to some of the survivors. The U.S. government settles some civil cases without admitting liability, no criminal accountability, the records destroyed. The man who ordered the destruction received a fine and went home. This is the end of the list, 17 events. 17 times the government killed, experimented on, imprisoned, bombed, or suppressed the American people, and then worked to erase what it had done. Some of the erasure failed, some succeeded for decades, some is still ongoing. The reason to know these things is not to conclude that the government is irredeemably evil. The reason is that democratic accountability requires a citizenry that knows what their government has done. You cannot hold institutions responsible for crimes you do not know they committed. You cannot demand justice for victims who have been written out of the record. These 17 events are documented, verified. Many of them are still unresolved. The question of what to do about that, about the people who were never compensated, the officials who were never charged, the history that was buried for decades, that is not a historical question. It is a current one. If you made it to the end of this video, you already know the answer has something to do with refusing to look away. Outrow 17 events, 2 centuries of buried history, and what ties every single one of these stories together is not just the crime itself, it is the cover-up. It is the institutional decision, made at the highest levels of American power, to destroy the documents, rewrite the narrative, suppress the witnesses, and wait for time to do the rest of the forgetting. Sometimes it worked. The Wilmington coup of 1898 was described as a race riot for 100 years. Thousands of children grew up in North Carolina being taught a lie about their own city's history. Sometimes it only partially worked. MKUltra's records were 90% destroyed. But the 10% that survived was enough to confirm that the government spent 20 years conducting non-consensual drug experiments on American citizens, and the man who ordered the shredding paid a fine and went home. And sometimes it failed entirely because a journalist found the right source, because a whistleblower kept a copy, because survivors refused to stay quiet, because the medical examiner told the truth anyway, because someone broke into an FBI office and mailed the documents to the press. The stories in this video are not warnings about what might happen. They are records of what did happen. They are documented, declassified, verified, and in the public record, often only because someone fought hard to put them there. History is not what happened. History is what we choose to remember, to teach, and to demand accountability for. The rest is what powerful people hope you forget. Don't forget. If this video reached you, if any part of it mattered to you, share it. The algorithm doesn't favor dark history, and these stories don't spread without help from people who think they should. Subscribe, leave a comment with the event that hit you hardest, and come back for the next one, because there are more.